But with that, let's get started. Are you seeing my presentation slides at this point?
Yes, we are.
Perfect. Okay, we're gonna get going from here then. Okay. All right. So, who am I? I'm Andrew Coe. I'm the 2023 U.S. Coffee Roasting Champion. I finished third place in the 2023 World Coffee Roasting Championships. I'm the owner of Elevator Coffee, a small volume specialty coffee roaster based in Portland, Oregon. I'm the head of quality control, roasting and green buying. I helped start Elevator as a cafe in 2015, and we began roasting in 2016. And before that, I had been a hobbyist home roaster. I started roasting in about 2011. So I've had experience roasting on quite a few different production machines. Our current production roaster is a 1930s Probot. It's a 12 kilo. It's been heavily modified with custom burners, variable fan and drum speeds. It's a really cool machine. Prior to that, we were roasting on a 10 kilo Proster. But I also have experience on several other machines. In the lead up to the World Championships, we used the Gießen W6A as the production roaster, so I practiced on that. I own a Stronghold S7 Pro, which was also used in the competitions. I've roasted on a Leo Bullet, the IKAWA. I've got a 50-gram Pro version 3. I've also roasted on a Coffee Crafters Artisan XL fluid bed roaster and Bmore 1600. So I've got a wide range of experience with pretty small machines and a variety of heat application methods. But my experience has been limited to basically 12 kilo machines and smaller. So that's kind of the frame of reference that I'm coming from. I know that there were already some questions about much larger machines, and I'll speak based on theory, but not off of personal practice. So after 10 years of living in Portland, Oregon, I recently moved to the high desert of St. George, Utah. It was a pleasant 101 degrees Fahrenheit here yesterday. Not quite in the full swing of summer, but it's getting warm. St. George is in the southwest corner of Utah. Its closest major city is Las Vegas. It's about 2 hours away. Salt Lake City is the biggest city in Utah, and that's about 5 hours north of us. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. Zion National Park is 45 minutes from my house. It's one of the most stunning places in the country as far as natural beauty. Prior to coffee, I worked at a civil engineering firm doing transportation planning. I have a master's degree in math, and so I worked on traffic models, estimating long range traffic projections. I'm also an avid endurance athlete. I've been a runner but can't run anymore. I do all kinds of cycling events, and so enjoy the outdoors. So that's just a little bit about me. So the topic today is, how do we use a sample roast or a sample roaster as a guide for production roasting? It always seems to be the question of, how do we use a sample roaster? Can we use a sample roaster in a way that helps us make decisions on our production roasts? Is it possible to create roast profiles on a sample roaster? When I first started roasting, I had I had a delineation in my head between sample roasting that was just for evaluating green coffee for purchasing, and possibly later to reevaluate my green coffee if there was some issue or just if I had some questions about that. And then production roasting was a separate process and had a separate purpose for customers, for cafes, and that was that. These were they were related, but sort of distinct things in my head, at least. But the longer that I've roasted and the more I've gotten experience on a variety of roasting machines, the more I started thinking about how to replicate roasts on different machines, even if they have different applications of heat, different batch sizes. Seemed to me that there should be a way to relate these roasts on different machines. So for me, I really started to do work on this when I started competing in national roasting competitions, because one of the primary tasks in the roasting competition is to connect sample roasts to production roasts. And I've spent the last few competitions working on this on this question of, even though machines have different physical properties, they have different applications of heat, how can we relate roasts of different sizes and on different machines so that we can say with confidence, if we're doing a sample roast, what might we get off of a production roast? So let's just come back to this question. Can we use our sample roaster to create profiles on a production roaster? Probably yes and no. It depends on what you mean by profiling. Can a sample roaster create a roasting recipe for your production machine? Probably not. There's mechanical limits to what each machine can do. Roasting is a highly complex system of inputs, variables. It can be hard enough just to replicate a roast on the same machine with the same batch size from week to week if you have a significant weather system blowing through. There's just enough variability within your environment and your systems that if you have two different roasters with different designs, different geometry, different heat source, heat application methods, these inputs are going to necessarily change how you roast. However, with all those things considered, can we still inform the adjustments that we might want to make on a production roaster based on what we learned from a sample roaster? And I think that's possible, and so that's what we're going to talk about here today. So I thought I would begin where I began, which was the roasting competitions. I got started in competing at the national level because in 2020, the finals of the US championships were supposed to be in Portland, and I thought it would be cool to compete in the finals in my hometown. So I qualified for finals in March of 2020, which was a weird time to do anything. The world kind of blew up and got really weird for a while, and so finals actually didn't happen in Portland that year. And in fact, finals didn't happen until 2 years later in 2022 in Boston, and I took 5th place there. But in 2023, finals came back to Portland, and so I got really excited, qualified for finals again, and this time I won, which was amazing. It was sort of all the things coming together in just the right way. Amazing to win at home, of all places. So let's talk a little bit about how competitions work, because they're interesting. Unlike other competitions, there aren't semifinals and finals rounds that happen during the competition. Everyone who comes and participates is going to be involved the entire competition, that whether it's in qualifiers or finals. No one gets eliminated during the process of the competition. And all the equipment is provided and the coffee is provided on site. So you can show up empty-handed and compete. And unlike some of the other competitions where you do a lot of sourcing ahead of time and a lot of preparation ahead of time and a lot of just so much practice, and Roasters is not like that. Most of your preparation is practicing on the compulsory equipment if you have access to it, because you know ahead of time what the roasting machines will be, what the evaluation tools will be. But you don't know what the green coffee will be until the competition begins. So you really only have about 3 days from the start of the competition until the end to learn as much as you can about this new coffee that's been handed to you, or coffees if you have to produce a blend like at Worlds. And the beans are often somewhat challenging to roast. They can come from uncommon countries of origin. I've had to roast coffees from Taiwan, the Democratic Republic of Congo. They could be odd separations. We've roasted a C grade Kenya, so very small screen size. We've roasted past crop coffees. We've had coffees that are community lots that have a whole range of screen sizes and qualities. So they try and give you something challenging to work with as a roaster. Over the competition days, you evaluate your green coffee. You roast samples, you cup those roasted samples, you create a roast plan, which we'll talk about more in a minute. And once you've tasted and handed in your roast plan, at that point, you do a production roast for your panel of judges. And the only time competitors are able to taste the competition coffee is from their sample roast. But the judges don't taste your sample roast. They only evaluate your submitted production roast. Oops. All right. So with that kind of background of the roast plan, I'm going to pull up, or of the competition rather, I'm going to pull up the roast plan here. So let me just grab this. And let me... Yeah. Okay, so let's see. This is the roast plan score sheet that we use in competition. After evaluating your sample roast, you taste it, you fill out this roast plan score sheet, and it's very detailed. You can see here at the top, you have weight loss from your roast scored. You have your start temperature, end temperature scored. You have the color reading scored. And scrolling down, beyond those physical characteristics of your roast, you need to describe with accuracy your fragrance, aroma, flavor, aftertaste, acidity, sweetness, and mouthfeel. And there are a whole bunch of check boxes here, but the highest scoring roast plans will be both very precise and very accurate. So it's important that your sample roast be representative enough of your production roast that you know what changes you're going to make, know what those changes are going to taste and smell like, and physically what it's going to do to your weight loss, your roast color, etc. Let's open next the judges score sheet. Oop. Okay. This looks very much like the roast plan. But you can see the categories are the same. The judges are evaluating both a quality score of 0 to 9, how high quality is this cup in each category: fragrance, flavor, aftertaste, acidity, sweetness, mouthfeel. They're looking for any roast defects. And they're cupping all of the coffees blindly, first to come up with this effective coffee evaluation and assess it for quality. And then after all the judges have cupped and taken their notes, they compare your submitted roast plan to their notes and compare it for accuracy. So you get a second set of scores for the accuracy of your own coffee descriptors in each of these categories. And the total for each is 54 points. So the quality score and the accuracy score are of equal weight. And that means, right, your roast needs to be very good, but it also, your roast plan needs to be very accurate. So let's see, let's go back into my slides. Here we go. Roast plan, score sheet. There we go. So the key in these competitions is to relate your sample to production. And so at the US championships, there's enough time to roast a couple of samples, 2 or 3 samples. At Worlds, there's only time to roast 1 sample, because you're not just doing one coffee, you're doing a single origin coffee and a blend coffee. But in either case, you have a very limited time to collect all your data and make all your roasting decisions. Usually this is about a 24-hour period of time before you turn in your roast plan and roast your production roast. So it's about making fairly quick decisions, and knowing from your sample what your production roast is going to do, is the key to being successful in the competition. So in my practice, as I was leading up to the US championships and to Worlds, I wanted to find a method of relating how my sample roasts could approximate my production roasts, because that's obviously the sort of the key to the game here is figuring out that relationship. So how would you say that you could measure if 2 roasts on 2 different machines are similar? And when I think about that question, I also think about, what do we actually know about any given roast? There's a whole bunch of data that you can collect around a roast. You can obviously, of course, you're considering your taste, what's in the on the table, what's in the cup. But you can, if you have a color meter, you can measure the outside color of the beans. You can measure the inside color if you grind the coffee. You can take the difference between the interior and the exterior and measure that color difference. You can measure your weight loss. You have end time, end temperature. You could look at sort of the recipe, the trajectory of your roast, the phases of your roast from the beginning to drying to first crack and beyond. And I'll say you can break these data into two categories. Taste, color, weight loss, these are physical characteristics of the beans that have occurred because of the roast method you applied on your machine. And then your end time, end temperature, roast phases, these are markers sort of unique to your machine based on the precision of your logging devices and of your heat application, right? So the goal then is, if you want to match two roasts, is if you have a relatively similar heat application between the two systems, and you are able to achieve similar data from the two roasts on your sample and on your production. And this is I'll say similar. That's that's sort of a loose term, but you'll get a similar cup of coffee if you get similar color and weight loss. And to me, the most useful tool for determining this relationship is the color meter. Knowing that your interior and exterior colors match on both roasts give a really good indication, although not perfect, that the roasts were to a similar degree. When you're comparing weight loss, I think from my experience on different machines, your weight loss may vary. So if you have a recirculated indirect heating system like Loring, for example, there tends to be less weight loss compared to a traditional drum. And on a fluid bed roaster, I've noticed slightly higher weight loss relative to a traditional drum. So keep in mind that maybe what your roasting machine is will affect the mechanics and will affect your data. So another thing to say just regarding the color meter is be careful with your color meter. If your sample is overfull, if you create a mound and your sample is closer to the lens, it's going to read a lighter color. If it's not quite 100% full and you've got a hole in your sample, it's going to read darker. That distance from your sample to the lens really matters. But if you use your leveling tool and make your samples as flat and consistent as possible, both for your whole bean and for your ground samples, you're gonna get more consistency. And it's especially if you're new to taking color readings, taking multiple samples, averaging them to get a final score that can help normalize any inconsistencies from your preparation. And the grind size really matters for the ground color, because obviously the more surface area is exposed of the inside of the coffee, the lighter your color is going to read. So just for reference, when I'm talking about colors here, I'm taking color samples using my cupping grind size. So just be aware of that. If you have different readings under different conditions with different grind sizes, that's to be expected.
I think that's a very good point, Andrew, and something to keep in mind. would you say that's like worth adding as an extra step of making sure that you're looking at your data correctly? Just like please grind in the same size, and that grinding for like cupping would be a good reference point.
Yeah, absolutely. The knowing if somebody is going to be evaluating your roast for color, knowing what grinder and what grind size they're using is really important. Kind of going back a few pages to the competition, they score a ground color number, and so while we were there and practicing in the lab, we all were hovering over the grinder and trying to figure out what their grind size was so that we could tell them what color we're using. So yeah, absolutely. That grind size is really important for consistency. Let's see. So my conjecture is that two roasts that have sufficiently close, quote unquote, colors, weight loss, roast times, or maybe roast phases are going to have produce similar results. Okay, so let's just talk about a methodology of how you would go about doing this. I would start with your production roaster. Have a coffee, use your production roaster, record your data, your roast time, your roast phases, your weight loss, your roast colors. And then from there, take that same coffee, green coffee, and go to your sample roaster and create a sample roast profile that matches these data points. And then taste them blindly. And adjust the sample as needed, because this obviously the sample roast is going to be using a lot less coffee. So that's where you can experiment around and just find a profile that matches. I keep saying kind of close enough, and I realize that's a very unsatisfying thing to say, but if you're using a 50-gram IKAWA like I am, just realize that some of your parameters or some of your measurements are going to depend on the precision of the tools that you're using. If you are measuring out exactly 50.0 grams and putting that into your IKAWA, roasting it, and then measuring the outcome, the precision of your scale, even if it's 1/10 of a gram, when you measure your weight loss, that precision could vary by up to almost half a percentage point just based on rounding off of a 1/10 of a gram sample. So sort of some ballparks that I would recommend is when I say close enough, if color is within 1 point on your scale, that's probably close enough. If weight loss is plus or minus 0.5%, that's probably close enough. And when I say close enough with roast phases, I think the key measurement when you're looking at how similar is my roast curve is the time from beginning of first crack to the end, and taking that, Scott Rao calls that your development time, right? Or maybe doesn't call it development time, but it's that post first crack development time and matching that percentage by around maybe 1% on each machine. Right. So let's assume you're able to make this match. You got your production roast, you've experimented with your samples, and you've got a good match between both machines. You have a profile on your production, you have a profile on the sample roaster. Let's set aside just the roasting recipe and all the gas settings and the airflow settings and all of those things, and just focus on a single endpoint. You could think about this final point as an XY coordinate system plotting just time and temperature, right? If we call this related sample roast our baseline production sample roast, what would you do with this now? I'm going to suggest that if you have a sample roaster, that it's easy to create recipes like with an IKAWA. You can try to adjust the end of your roast parameters just in one plane at a time. So you can adjust just your end time, or you can adjust just your end temperature. Obviously, when I say you're adjusting just one thing, roasts are not discontinuous in the sense that you can just adjust your end temperature without affecting other things. But for the sake of building a framework for comparison, let's just try to keep one variable as our, or sorry, one plane as our variable and one plane as our fixed constant, right? And you could test a whole bunch of scenarios, but I'm going to suggest if you have your baseline and you build 4 additional profiles, one that adjusts just for temperature and both cooler and hotter, and one that adjusts just for time, longer and shorter, you now have 5 sample roast curves that you can experiment with your green coffee. And you could do this a whole number of times. If you find a favorite in any direction, you could go up to that. Let's say you like your coffee at a 5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter end temperature. Go to that point and rebuild this process from that starting point, and you could increase again by 5 degrees, and you could adjust your end times and temperatures. So there's a lot you can do just with playing kind of by moving the dial, if you will, in one direction or the other. So let's just walk through a case study at this point. So I've got a nice green coffee. It's a pink Bourbon from Finca Villa Betulia. It's from Huela, Colombia, grown at 1,550 meters, had 11.5% moisture, a cup score of 86, and was harvested in December of 2023. Here's what my production roast looked like. This is a 22-pound batch on my Probot, and the output was 19.1 pounds. That's a weight loss of 13%. The roast color was 74.5 for the exterior of the bean and 81.2 for the interior. I was getting cupping notes of raspberry lemonade, high sweetness, high acidity. It was bright, punchy coffee. Had kind of a very balanced overall cup. As it cooled, kind of that lemonade flavor kind of went more towards sweet lemon bar, and on the cool cup, it's just a juicy, medium-bodied, very smooth coffee. From there, I went and built a sample roast to recreate a roast similar to that production roast. So this is the output from my IKAWA here. I pivoted this off of my green sample roast protocol. So you'll note it's a very short, kind of short and hot roast. But I've had good results with this as my green sample evaluation roast profile. So this was my starting point. There are many, many, many profiles you could use. And so if you're more concerned with roast times, wherever your starting point is for green coffee, maybe start there and then experiment with your endpoints. That would be my suggestion to match your data. So let's see. This roast had slightly higher weight loss, 13.2%. Again, I've noticed that to be the case with fluid bed roasters, but I've also got my phases are a little different. If you note when dry end is marked here, it's much earlier than on the Probot, and it could be that fluid bed roasters dry out the outside of the coffee sooner, or maybe I'm just not reading the color quite as accurately under my lighting here, or it could be that I'm at 10% humidity in St. George, and maybe that affects smaller samples more quickly, or particularly when you're using air roasters. What I was more concerned about here was my end from first crack to end. That was about 19.4%, which matched the 20% from my Probot. And the coffee's cupped in a similar way. So I thought this was a good match. Roast color was 73.9 exterior, 80.7 interior. So now that I had that roast, I called that my baseline. That is shown here in the center. It has an end time of 6 minutes, 17 seconds. The temperature reading was 410 Fahrenheit. So I created 4 new recipes. My goal was to just, with this, is to find what flavor differences are when I'm making these adjustments. And so my hotter profile increases by 5 degrees. My cooler decreases by 5 degrees. And then I changed my temperatures. I shortened by 30 seconds and I increased by 30 seconds. And the next step, one of my, okay. One of my markers went away, but it's okay. I collected data next, right? So these are the weight losses for each of these roasts. You'll just have to trust me that the hotter roast lost the most weight. The baseline roast was kind of right in the middle. The cooler roast loses less weight, and same with time. The shortest roast lost less weight. The longest roast lost more weight. That's probably what you would expect. So let's move on to color. The color readings here, there's a set of 3. So the exterior of the bean is the first color, interior is the second color, and the difference is the third. Kind of a similar pattern here. And particularly with the interior colors, you can see the shortest roast in terms of time had the lightest interior color. The longer roasts increased it in interior color. And same with the end temperature. The hotter the end temperature, the darker the inside of the bean, which totally makes sense. And the cooler, the lighter the inside of the bean. Where this gets interesting and gets fun is cupping these. I when I'm looking at cupping, I usually do kind of a standard cupping protocol. I evaluate aromas, dry aromas, fragrance, wet aromas, break, and then I do 3 passes for my evaluation: hot, medium, and cool. For me, that's 12 minutes, 16 minutes, 20 minutes. And for me, when the coffee is hot, I'm better able to differentiate acids, note any kind of particularly upfront flavors. As the coffee goes to medium, I get more of a sense of the actual like expression of fruit flavors that the acids are relating with sweetness to create sweetness and aroma, I guess, to create, I get more of the like picture of sweetness. And on the cool cup, I have a lot, noting body, texture, finish. So this cup, the baseline, has nice kind of round lemon, orange, upfront flavors, acids. As the coffee cooled, it kind of had a sweetness of lemonade, balanced cup. Throughout, these coffees all demonstrated pretty nice acidity, pretty good balance, pretty good body. I think the one cup that I didn't really enjoy was the short roast. The roast that was shorter in time had a particularly astringent and drying finish. Even though the body was similar to the other cups, something about the short roast time created an unpleasant mouth drying note. And actually, the hottest roast and the longest roast were probably my two favorites in terms of sweetness and of taste. So I've done a few of these analyses and I've noticed quite a few things. So I thought it would be interesting to just kind of talk about trends of what can sometimes be fixed by shifting your endpoints. And so if your baseline roast has too much acids, dryness, thin body, if it's underdeveloped, add heat. If your baseline roast is baked in its flavors, has poor cup clarity, shorten your roast time. If the baseline roast has a dry finish, it has poor cup balance. If it has some aged flavors like paper, cardboard, adding roast time can help with that. And if the roast has low acids or too much bitterness, if it's overdeveloped, you can lower your heat. But these are general trends, and it's not always true of every coffee. And so sometimes a roast will surprise you. And I always encourage people to keep an open mind when they're doing an evaluation like this and cup the coffees blind, so that no preconceived biases can affect how you're tasting things. But also, I think it's important to keep your audience and the purpose of whatever coffee you're evaluating in mind, because who you're roasting for matters in how you're roasting it. Roast decisions that I would make for a competition and for my house espresso blend are going to be different because the audience is very different. And when I go online and I hear, on forums and things, a lot of times the comment is roast to what you like. And yes, for your brand or your roast methodology. It should reflect your preferences. But if your favorite espresso in the world is the most lightly roasted Kenyan coffee, and that's what you make for your default espresso offering, your baristas and your customers might have a really hard time with that. So just keep that in mind, but you know, it's your business, so do what you want. All right. So now what? If you find an improvement on your cupping table, you can redo this experiment, as I was mentioning, as many times as you want. You can adjust how much you're changing your end temperatures. You can change how much you're changing your end times. You can, but every time you're making changes, try and replicate that favorite batch from the last round as your center point, right? That can help confirm that that really is the best way to go and that that's a replicable result. And then once you land on a sample that is where you want it to be, what does that mean for your production roasts? Again, collect all your data. So if your favorite roast, for example, is plus 5 degrees Fahrenheit of end temperature, take that back to your production roaster and create a recipe that moves your endpoint in that direction, so that your production roast can match your color readings and your weight loss. It might not be exactly that you need to match your color readings and your weight loss, particularly to your sample. But if you take the difference of your original baseline sample and your new favorite sample, you can also collect data there, right? So you could take the difference between the interior roast colors, and you could take the difference between your weight loss, and then move that back to your production roast and try to move in that increment, if that makes sense, right? So that, for example, if your interior roast color changed, it got 2 degrees darker, and that was your favorite, try to go back to your production, see what your interior roast color was, and move your end temperature up so that you get 2 degrees more interior development, right? So it can be a relative shift on each machine. It won't necessarily be a one-to-one relationship where 5 degrees hotter on the IKAWA means 5 degrees hotter on the large production roaster. But at least you now have a direction that you want to go. Okay. So I think that the takeaways from this is that you can relate production roasts and sample roasts, and unlocking your sample roaster in this way just creates a really powerful tool that minimizes coffee waste. It really allows for experimentation without a lot of overhead of additional coffee being roasted. But keep in mind, your different roasters have different heat applications, so the connections between those two roasts is not always going to be as precise as mathematically we would want it to be. But trust your taste buds if you have doubts. And changing just one variable is not that simple, but don't overcomplicate it. What we're trying to build is an easy, repeatable method to inform your production roasting changes without using a large amount of green coffee and without just guessing, right? Okay, so I think at that point, I'm going to wrap up my presentation point, and I'm happy to hear some questions.
Well, first of all, this was really great. It's been amazing to follow you talking about this, and I've related it to quite a few things in my mind, and mostly other people did as well. It's very interesting to see this approach of going from your production roaster to sample roaster and then just playing with that information. I think most people would be tempted to do the other way around and sort of hope for the perfect recipe to go. Is like, oh, I'll just, take the same events and hope for the best. I think this might actually, make some people think about it. I completely agree with the point of trusting your test buds. Met many roasters in my time since joining IKAWA that were just like, oh yes, we don't make that many changes in our roast profiles really. We're just like cupping and whatever tastes best, that's it. They're always just like, oh, it needs to taste great. It doesn't need to be the perfect roast profile that I think it's just technically accurate or technically great, because that's not always the case. So great information here. I'm gonna let people see if they have any questions specifically for you. If you want to just kind of summarize your process a little bit, just like you do production first, and then you go back to the sample roast, and then how does it all go? Just like if you were to summarize it a little bit, because I think we walked through quite a little bit of information.
Sure, yeah. Definitely, I would say the starting point is where you're at on your production roaster now. Because presumably you've been there for a while and you have some knowledge about that machine, and you have some feeling, presumably, about how you can change the outcomes of your roast. But sometimes there's cases where your coffee is just changing with age, or you have a new variety or a new process, and you don't know necessarily where to start, but you know where you've been with other coffees. So if you can build this production to sample relationship off of a known coffee that you've roasted a lot, and you can get that to match, then you can start experimenting on your sample roast. But you would probably, so match your samples, because it's much easier to do lots and lots of repetition on the sample roaster and get that to match without using pounds and pounds and pounds in your production roaster. So use that as your experimentation tool, and you will have much less waste. But then collect as much data and be precise with it as you can, and take really good notes on your sample roasts. And then when you find a place that you want to be with your sample roasting experimentation, create that pathway of the best roast was 5 reps in, and I moved my my time by this amount, and I moved my temperature by this amount, and let that inform how you adjust your production roast recipe. But don't take it as like a one-to-one relationship, I guess I will say, of it moved exactly 10 degrees up and 30 seconds forward. You'll still have to match your data on the new production roast, and that could take some experiments there too, but at least you have a framework that got you some conclusions without in an objective way. If presumably you're cupping all these things blind, you can arrive somewhere relatively quickly. Yeah. So I guess that's how I would summarize.
Great, thank you. We do have just a couple of questions, and one of them is, would it be possible to go from sample roast on IKAWA to a production roaster? Have you specifically tried it?
So the question being, I just nailed my sample roast, and now I just want that to happen on my production roast. I think that's the question, right? Well, I would say, I guess I have, in the sense that if I know what nailing it is on a sample roast, I have an end temperature, I have an end time, I have kind of the path of whatever that sample roast was, I have roast colors, I have the phases from my IKAWA. I can target that end color at least on my production roast and say, I know that on my sample roast, that end color tasted great. And then if you have a really good handle on your production roaster, you can at least get fairly close to that by saying, oh, on my production roaster, I know that my end time needs to be something like this, my end temperature needs to be something like this, and it'll get me this pairing of roast colors. Let's see where that goes. So that would be how I would try and take it from the sample roaster just to the production roaster without doing any other work.
All right, that sounds great. To kind of complete a little bit of this question, since we have launched our Pro 100X, we've seen different approaches as well, just because there's new information available with it, like the moisture release graph. And one of our customers, the team from Square Mile Puck Roasters, is using a baseline simple sample roast on the Pro 100X just to see how the coffee behaves when moisture is being released, just so they make a better informed decision on when to apply heat. So there's different information you can look at. Obviously, just as Andrew said, he is working on a V3, and that information is not available on it. But depending on how much information you can get out of a sample, then you can get closer to, making better informed decisions into building a production roast. All right. The next question was, when after a roast do you take a color measurement? I imagine, do you leave it for resting? Do you do I imagine that's sort of the direction that people are going in, is like a preferred time. Do you just go through all of your samples, all of your roasts, and then you do it? When does it fall into your routine?
Yeah, that's a great question. I cup everything about 2 days after production, and so I do all my color readings and production samples 2 days afterwards. However, a few weeks ago, I was helping, or a month, I don't know, some time ago, I was helping somebody dial in a machine that was new to me. It was a fluid bed Coffee Crafters artisan roaster, and I've never roasted on a fluid bed except the IKAWA. And so I went in and we started doing roasts, and immediately afterwards I was taking color readings because I wanted to know, what is this profile doing to my beans? I kind of have an idea from the samples what these should be, but am I getting anywhere close? And so in that case, I was taking color readings immediately after the roast as soon as it was cool, so that I could quickly dial it in and get to recipes that I thought would be useful on that production machine. So if that helps, that's what I typically do.
There's another question of where do you start when you're trying to build similar profiles? It's just like similar results. And I think we've kind of gone through this already, where you've explained that you're using mostly just end temperature, color readings, and obviously taste, after all, as your criteria to start it. And then there's a question that says, what dose do you recommend on a Pro 100 version 3? Do you go with the full 100 grams, or have you noticed that there's maybe better consistency with the lower dose? What is your approach with that?
So I have the 50-gram model, and I use a scale with a 1/10 of a gram precision and try to always roast exactly 50 grams.
All right.
Yeah. Sometimes my sample is a little short, but I record it down to a 1/10 of a gram, and I feel it 100%. Yeah.
So to kind of answer this question, Andrew is using the exact maximum capacity. What we do recommend with the 100 grams, we've always said 80 to 100 grams. So maybe there's, other factors that kind of go into this as well. We can always chat more about this. If you want to drop us an email or if you want to drop us an DM on Instagram, we can look into this more and expand on this question. And I saw that Lawrence has his hand raised. If you want to go ahead and drop a question or say your question,
Yes,
however you prefer.
It's probably easier to say it. I don't know that I fully understand how to use the data set from a production roast to create a profile on the IKAWA, since there's no term-to-term equivalence between beginning end temperatures, total time, and so forth. How would I? Any guidance there?
Sure. Is there a roast profile you typically use on the IKAWA?
No, because I'm newer to it, so I'm using the profiles in the library,
Yeah,
usually almost at random, just to see what the outcome is.
sure. So I've been using my IKAWA for a while, and I had a particular importer that I liked their sample roasts when I was getting started, and that was my starting point was borrowing their recipe, which I think was just a slightly modified version of the standard IKAWA sample profile. It's the one that's just in the library as a starting point. If I were starting from scratch, I think Rob Hoos wrote a blog recently on the IKAWA page about his starting point on the version 3, or his conclusions with using a version 3, and that might be a nice read and a nice starting point, particularly because those roast times are actually closer to at least what I use for production. But I would say, yeah, definitely experiment with it. I've kind of always just used a modified version of the standard IKAWA profiles, edited slightly for their end time and edited slightly for their end temperature to my preferences. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yes.
that's where I started from. Okay.
It's a good start, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Then I have one more question. What would be the reason that the same coffee has a different color reading if it's roasted to the same temperature and the same end time? One would be roasted on a ProBat 25 kilo and one on the IKAWA Pro.
Well, the end temperature in the IKAWA is going to be not a direct bean mass measurement. The probe is in a different place. So that if the time and the end temperatures are the same, the data point is from a slightly different place in the IKAWA versus on your production machine. So that's one thing. I would say, yeah, I mean, so the data are different. I guess that's the main point.
Right. There is a question that says, in your experience, that the same IKAWA profile always give the same ground color readings for every coffee, or does it change depending on the coffee? If that's the case, did you notice a trend?
Yeah, it'll vary based on the coffee for sure. If you get if the most obvious being, if you grab an Ethiopian natural process and compare it to a washed coffee from Colombia or somewhere, and you run the exact same profile and you measure the colors, the natural process typically is going to have lighter interior color, probably lighter exterior color. The washed is going to be darker in both those respects. So it is largely dependent on the green coffee that you're using that is going to be the color reading that you get. Yeah.
Yes, completely agreed. How do you read color during roasting? Just as an eye evaluation, some color cards, color meter to mark phases.
Yeah, that's a great question. We assert phases based on temperature in our production. And that way, I have an employee who's colorblind. That way we don't have to nitpick what is yellow versus what is green. We just determine it based on a temperature. And as long as we're matching that temperature and time along our roast curve axis, we call that a good match. And that way we don't have to necessarily worry about what's the lighting doing? Who's on the roaster today? Do they have a very good eye for seeing color differences? So that's how we do it.
That's great. I think this is also something that could be a little bit related to first crack, though different, slightly related. There's an entire discussion about when first crack does actually appear. And sometimes it is up to the person that is actually doing the roast, and then to the approach of the roastery or the roaster. Some people consider the very, very first crack to be first crack, and then some people just consider the first round of beans cracking as first crack. So also something to keep in mind if that was at any point a question in your mind. If did I hear it right? Did I hear it wrong? It is unfortunately still a an open to discussion thing, but yes.
And I'll
The
say
next one.
too, with the first crack, I had a unique experience a few weeks ago roasting with someone a very, very old natural process Ethiopian coffee that had no audible crack, but the temperature said this is first crack. And so we called it first crack, we dropped it when we thought we should, and the coffee was developed enough, but no audible first crack. So
That's even interesting.
yeah.
Would you say that measuring TDS and measuring WL provides similar information?
WL as in weight loss?
I would believe so.
But TDS? Like brewed TDS? I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure.
Would the person that asked this question kindly confirm if it is yes brewed? There we go.
Okay. Weight loss to TDS. And TDS being on the cupping table for cupped samples. I don't have a lot of experience with this, so I'm probably not the one to ask about this question.
All right, thank you. Andrew, I noticed that you're using artisan software as I do. I'm also used to dry ramp development. I have a very hard time with color change. Any tips on how to do this?
Yeah, so again, in our roastery, we assert our color change temperature at 330 Fahrenheit. So we don't try and actually go through the sight glass and get an exact color. We are just marking at a temperature, and we want that to be hitting at the correct time.
All right. I have been slightly dubious of my color reader as exactly the same sample of beans or grounds will measure fairly different readings, approximately 6 angstrom. On subsequent measurement reshuffled, measured again. I always use the same grind setting and level the sample properly. Any ideas, or have you had any similar experiences?
6 points seems like a very large range to me.
Yes.
I would question that, like you're doing. What I'm curious is are you having strange outliers? Like if you measure the same beans 5 times in a row, do you have 4 are normal and 1 is off by 6, or is it just all of them are off? It's possible there's some issue with the hardware. I'm not sure.
Yes.
It could be that the lens is dirty. I don't know how to clean it. You could look in your manual, but that could cause some weirdness.
Okay. All right. I noticed that your IKAWA sample roast utilizes the exhaust PID, whereas Rob Hoos recommends using the input temperature. How have your scale-up matching results differed when using one versus the other method?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I just read Rob's article this week, and I haven't really fully digested it. However, if I were starting from scratch today on the IKAWA, I would at least experiment with both, because I am curious if his method is more consistent or just the roast is significantly longer on his suggested recipe versus the standard recipe that I've been using. I think his is 9-10 minutes long versus mine, which is like 6. So at least in terms of time, perhaps the phases and the time are going to match better to a production roaster, and so maybe there's more interesting relationships there to consider. I wish I would have read that article earlier, but unfortunately I just caught Rob this anyway. So definitely an interesting read. I would heavily consider just adopting that straight away and then experimenting with other samples and just find for you what you prefer with the taste and the outcomes. But yeah, interesting for sure.
Have you found in your experience that shorter roasts yield more vibrant cups than a longer roast?
Yes. Here's what I would say on that. If you cup immediately after roasting, or not immediately after roasting, but say one day after roasting, use the same coffee and do a short roast and a long roast and see which one tastes better one day after, and then a week after, and then 2 weeks after. And I think it's pretty illuminating, but that would be an exercise for the reader, I guess.
I think a good example in this case would also be the fact that there are competitors who use quite short and aggressive roasts in their competition right before performing on stage, just so they can get like extremely vibrant cups of coffee. The thing to say with this is that usually what happens is that coffee kind of dies much faster as well. An example in this sense would be Patrick Rolfe, who won with a cup of coffee like that, but he also said that, yeah, you know, in 2 weeks, it's kind of slowly dying out. All right. Are there differences between drum roasting and fluid bed roasting significant enough to account for when scaling your recipe? Is there any good literature about fluid bed roasting that you recommend?
Well, that's a really good question. I haven't found any really great fluid bed roaster literature. I think that fluid bed roasters are the minority, and it would be great to have a better relationship between the two. But and I think that there are companies working on interesting things with fluid bed roasters right now. So I mean, certainly it can be a very efficient way of roasting coffee. In my experience with the machines that I've used, occasionally, because I'm used to a drum that's so stable in terms of heat, fluid bed roasters move much quicker, and so in my experience, they're a little harder to control, a little less forgiving, I guess is what I'll say. But I don't have a great research paper or anything to point to that would be a good resource. But I do think that they're certainly different.
I see a question for us as the IKAWA team, and I'm just going to skip it for now. We're going to go back to it after we run through the questions for Andrew, just so we don't keep people that maybe are not interested in this topic necessarily. When taking a color measurement, what is your protocol? Do you take multiple measurements and average them? Do you spread the ground, adding layer of ground coffee for each measurement?
Yeah, I do. Typically I'll average either 3 or 5 samples. And I, I if I have a very small sample of roasted coffee, I'll take my sample cup, run the sample, dump it back into my very small sample, mix it a little bit, and then pour out a new sample, level it really evenly, measure again 3, 5 times. Same with ground coffee. I dump the coffee back in, stir it up, dump it back. Typically the whole bean has more variance, the ground has less variance. That's what I'll say.
How do you decide what load temperature is the best? Excuse me. Are there general best practices for the first 2 minutes of the roast? How does it usually affect roasted coffee taste?
Wow, that's a whole roasting theory question. But, yeah, it depends on how you like to roast, I guess. If the amount of energy that you put in when you're loading your roast can absolutely determine how fast your roast can go. And conversely, if you lower that temperature to a certain point, it'll limit how fast you can go. You'll never be able to catch back up if you max out your everything afterwards. There's only a certain limit to how much heat the coffee can absorb. So adjusting that so that you're able to hit your goal roast time without creating any sort of tipping or scorching defects, that to me, that's kind of where you want to be. I also suggest, giving yourself enough capacity in your roaster so that you have some wiggle room on your power. You're not always just maxing out your power, because if you get to a condition where suddenly the roastery is 10 degrees colder because it's a winter storm, and you're still trying to use your summer roast profiles that require you to max out all of your power, your roast times are going to be very different under those much cooler conditions. And so yeah, just give yourself enough room that you can roast consistently all year round, I guess, is my guidance there.
You mentioned earlier that you had some perspective on scaling up to 12 kilograms machines. Can you elaborate a bit on those ideas? What new considerations are especially important in your mind?
And I presume this means scaling from the sample roaster to the production roaster.
Maybe even from your current, let's say, 5 kilograms to a 12 kilogram, like what are some things you would consider? Or greater than 12 kilograms. So let's say you're starting off from 5 and you're going on like 50.
Yeah. I would want to, if I was making that large of an investment, I would want to spend time on that machine, either with the manufacturer or someone, so that I had assurance that I was actually getting the capacity that I wanted out of that machine. So if you are the sort of roaster that roasts really, really fast, and you're used to loading your 5-kilo roaster to 100% capacity and somehow finishing your roasts in 10 minutes or 9 minutes even, is that something that you feel is necessary to replicate on a larger machine? And if so, what capacity can it actually, do you have to only fill it to 75% in order to achieve your roast times? Or can you actually fill it the way you want to? So I think that's what I would consider. Yeah.
Great. I'm gonna go back to the IKAWA question, if there isn't anything else for Andrew specifically. Do we have anything? Oh, someone is thanking you for reigniting their curiosity in roasting samples. They're definitely gonna try and nail their production roasts compared to samples. Do you plan on visiting World of Coffee? This was actually one of the questions I had for Andrew as soon as he jumped on. I think we're all gonna be super excited for him that he's actually gonna go back in competition next year. So while he's not joining World of Coffee this year, he's going to be representing US again, hopefully. Cross fingers for that. And I'm currently scaling from IKAWA to a 35K and 70K lowering. Any tips? Have you specifically roasted on a lowering before?
No, but my understanding is that they have plenty of power, but also a lot of integrated data that you can use. And so, you know, I personally haven't ever stepped up to a machine that size. And so I would say, you know, start with getting some recommendations for, you know, charge temperatures, for charge weights, experiment before you have to go live if you can, so that you get an understanding, you know, of your roast dynamics, because new large machines are going to probably roast differently than what you're used to. So, but also good luck with that, because that sounds awesome.
That's great. Just to follow up on this, we do have quite a bit of love in the IKAWA community for lowering roasters. So ultimately, if you're interested in this, we can always try to find someone from our community that can talk a little bit more on this. Maybe put you in touch with someone that is both an IKAWA user and a lowering user. And then you can just exchange knowledge. That is something that we'd be happy to do. Feel free to drop me an email to the email that I invited you from. And I think we can get some more answers for you on that. What kind of roast profile would you utilize for a coffee you've never used before to sample before buying? That's a great question. Because obviously IKAWA is above all a sample roaster. Even if you're not going to use it for profiling, it's just great to use as a sample roaster to accurately assess your coffee and make sure you're making good buying decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would consider as much information as you can get from that coffee. If you know the elevation, if you know the variety, if you know the process, if you know, I mean, as much as you can relate it to something similar that you've done, I would say try and relate it there and use that as a starting point. Even better if you have enough green coffee sample. If they send you 200 grams and you have a 50-gram roaster, experiment with some of these adjustments, like lower your end temperatures if this has some sort of process to it. If it's a naturally processed coffee in any way, even if it's anaerobic, consider that natural process is going to probably require a gentler, slower roast. Otherwise, you know, it can take on additional heat too quickly. If, you know, it's, if you, for example, only roast really low elevation coffees, and this is a much higher elevation coffee, it's going to take a lot more energy to get the heat into that coffee. So, yeah, you know, as much as you can, use the information that you have to kind of make informed decisions. And then if you have some time to experiment, definitely experiment with it. Or, you know, roast one sample and cup it, and then based on how it tastes, do another one that moves in the direction that you think would be most useful for that coffee, I guess. So, yeah.
All right, that's great. Just to follow up on this, I'm subscribing to everything that Andrew said, and just from talking to our community, what I've noticed most people do is that they will try to sort of assess coffees and samples just okay, I'm going to try all of my Colombians in one part, and I'm going to try all the coffee that I have from Guatemala in one part, and so on and so forth. Or they're going to be trying to assess things by process. And most of the sampling profiles that we've seen so far from our community are very non-invasive, if I can use this term, just as simple as possible, just inflicting as little as possible on the coffee so you can actually assess the how do I put this? How well a coffee could behave in the end, how much can you actually get in that coffee in the end. Most people would just try to not do anything too crazy or too drastic to it, because then you just taste the roast instead of tasting the coffee, right? I have another question which says, nobody could have explained this to me before. What does an espresso roast mean compared to filter roast? How should it taste in cupping to determine if it's good for espresso?
It's another whole seminar worth of questions.
Maybe we should do this into a series.
There's a lot of different theories about what makes good espresso. A lot of there's roasters like Elevator who have we're omni roasters. We roast each coffee the same, and then or not the same, but we have one roast. We don't specify drip versus espresso. We think that our roast is able to be utilized in both ways. But there's many other roasters who have two separate roast profiles for each coffee, and they will have an espresso roast and a filter roast. And typically the espresso roast is more developed, either longer time, probably longer time, maybe hotter end temperature. The filter roast typically shorter, maybe cooler end temperature, but the goal usually is for the filter roast to have more vibrant acidity, and for the espresso roast to have really nice texture and good sweetness, really nice balance. Because the idea is anytime you're concentrating all of the flavors in your coffee, if you have an inherently acidic coffee, when you concentrate that down into an espresso, that acidity that can be very nice and pleasant in a filter cup, in a pour over, in a batch brew, suddenly becomes overwhelming as an espresso, and so roasting in a way, either with a longer time or a higher end temperature that mellows your acidity, can present that espresso in a way that's a little more pleasant to your audience. So
that's a great answer. I think this is the last question, and it says, with larger roasters, for example, just like 35 kg plus, do you still recommend starting with the production roast to baseline the roast profile? Seems like a ton of green coffee to go through.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that also assumes that maybe you haven't used the 35 kilo at this point, and this is a new machine to you. But if not, then just take what you're producing now, so that you're not starting there. But if it is a new machine, then yeah, I would recommend doing some practice on it. You're going to need to practice to get good at it anyway. So that's going to be an investment that you're going to make is running coffee through it. And so as you're practicing, find what's working well and note those data, and then take that to your sample roaster. That's what I would say.
I'm now going to go back to the question for the IKAWA team, which I have to scroll a little bit through. Will there be addition of a color meter reader embedded inside the IKAWA machine in the future? I'm just gonna let Ed answer this one. Actually, I'm just gonna mute myself very quickly.
Yeah, hey everybody. So in terms of embedding a colorimeter inside the roaster, most likely not, because those two technologies need to stay separate and there's not a lot of space within the roaster at the moment. In terms of color reading and with our roaster, I think looking at partnerships of who we could work with is probably a more realistic goal for IKAWA going forward. But yeah, having that technology inside a roaster would be very, very, very tricky because it's very hot inside the roasting chamber and we won't want to melt a color reader in there. I hope that answers your question.
All right. I guess this is really the last chance if anyone has any more questions. Okay. Someone says Andrew is awesome. We agree, 100%. We're very thankful for your time today. This has been very helpful and I hope insightful for everybody who joined us today. As we've seen many questions, so people are definitely loving having you here answering this. Questions. Can we get a copy of the slides? We will make a recording available. I will have to check with Andrew if sharing his slides is an option. But if that is, we will be making it available for sure. And yeah.
Yeah, that was great. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate everybody's questions. And thank you again to the IKAWA team for having me here. Really, really was fun.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Till the next time, hopefully we'll meet again on a format like this with other interesting people. And who knows, maybe we're going to be inviting Andrew after he wins again.